A one-woman crime wave, 1931. A Great Depression had swept over the nation, and we couldn't seem to throw it off. It was still hoovering over us, as people said. Herbert Hoover was president at that time. It hadn't bottomed out yet, but it was heading that way. You could see hard times from the window of the Wabash Bluebird. The freight trains on the siding were loaded down with men trying to get from one part of the country to another, looking for work and something to eat. Mary Alice and I watched them as they stood in the open doors of the freight cars. They were walking along the right-of-way, too, with nothing in their hands. Then, when we got off the train at Grandma's, a new sign on the platform read, "Drifters, keep moving. This means you. Signed, O.B. Dickerson, Sheriff." But at Grandma's house, it seemed to be business as usual. Mary Alice was still skittish about the old snaggle-toothed tomcat in the cob house. Grandma said if we worried that much, she ought to use the chamber pot instead of the privy. Chamber pots were under all the beds, and they were handy at night. Now that's a bucket with a lid where you can use the bathroom instead of going outdoors. But Mary Alice wouldn't use hers during the day. She didn't want to climb the stairs just for that, and she didn't want to have empty it any more than necessary. Being 9, Mary Alice decided to take charge. She carried a broom to the privy to swat the cat if it gave her any trouble. She was soon back that first afternoon, dragging the broom. Her eyes were watering, and she was holding her nose. "Something died in the cob house," she said. "Nah," Grandma says, "it's cheese." "I don't want any," Mary Alice said. "Well, it's not for you," Grandma said. Now that they mentioned it, I could smell something pretty powerful wafting into the kitchen, and I could see the old tomcat from here, stretched out in the yard. He was breathing hard and nowhere near the cob house. The cheese smelled bad enough to gas a cat, but it was no use asking what it was for. We were bound to find out. Grandma's house was the last one in town. Next to the row of glads was a woven wire fence, and on the other side of that a cornfield. Now glads is the shortening for gladiolas, flowers. On the first nights, I'd always lie in bed listening to the husky whisper of the dry August corn in the fields. Then on the second night, I wouldn't hear anything. But this year came the sound of shuffling boots and sometimes a voice. The Wabash tracks that cut the town in two ran along the other side of the road. The sheriff's deputies were out carrying shotguns, moving the drifters along so they didn't hang around town to beg for food. From my window, I watched the swaying lanterns, and ahead of them the slumping figures of drifters heading for the next town. It was kind of spooky and sad. But it was a short night. At 5 the next morning, Grandma was at the foot of the stairs banging a spoon against a pan. When we got down to the kitchen, we found her in a pair of men's overalls stuffed into gum boots. She couldn't go outdoors in overalls, so she'd pulled a wash dress on over them, and her apron over that. Crowning it all was her gardening hat. She'd anchored it with a veil to keep the mosquitoes away, and tied it under her chin. She looked like a moving mountain. Mary Alice couldn't believe the overalls. "Keeps off the chiggers," Grandma explained. "We're going fishing." I looked around for rods and reels and at least some bamboo poles, but I didn't see anything. "It's just one thing after another in town," Grandma declared. "We wasn't over Decoration Day before it was the 4th of July. Then come the old settlers' picnic. You can't hardly get down the street for the crowds, and the dust never settles. I need a day off and some peace and quiet." Fresh from the Chicago loop, Mary Alice and I traded glances. We didn't linger over breakfast because of the smell. The cheese was on the back porch now in a gunny sack. It began to dawn on me that it was the kind of cheese that catfish consider a delicacy. Grandma was ready to go, and when she was ready, you'd better be. Let's get on the road," she said, taking a last look around the kitchen. "Douse that fire and hide the axe in the skillet." We blinked. "Oh, it's just a saying," Grandma said, "a country saying. I was a country girl, you know." She carried the gunny sack of cheese herself, tied to the end of a tree limb, hitched up on her shoulder. I was in charge of the picnic hamper, and it took all I had to lift it. I looked inside. Half the hamper was home-canned fruit, tomatoes, and pickled peaches. The other half was vegetables from her garden, snap beans, turnips, a cabbage, The only thing that looked like a picnic was a loaf of unsliced, home-baked bread. But I didn't ask. Grandma saved herself a lot of bother by not being that kind of a person you question. We trooped out into the morning behind her. As soon as we left her yard, we were in the country, but I had the feeling it would be a long trip. The hamper weighed a ton, and I had no luck getting Mary Alice to carry the other handle. We were well covered against chiggers, and the day was already too hot. Mary Alice preferred skirts, but she had on her play suit with the long pants. Being 11, I was way too old for shorts anyway, so I had on jeans. We marched behind Grandma, and it wasn't too bad until the sun came up over the tassels on the corn. We ate the dust of the road for a mile or so. Of course, being a city boy, I didn't know what a mile was, but it felt like a mile. At a stand of timber, we veered across a pasture. "Watch your step," Grandma said. "Cow pies aplenty." We were making for Salt Creek, and pretty soon the trees along the creek began to show on the horizon. But there was like a mirage that keeps its distance. Finally, we came to a barbed wire fence with a sign on it. "No trespassing whatsoever. No fishing, nothing. Private property of the Piatt County Rod and Gun Club. Signed, O.B. Dickerson, Sheriff." "Lift that wire so I can skin under," Grandma said. The lowest wire was pretty close to the ground, but Grandma was already flat on her back in the weeds. She'd pushed the cheese through. Now she began to work her shoulders to inch herself under. I pulled up on the wire to the best of my ability, but there wasn't much slack to it. The barbs snagged her hat, though they cleared her nose. But now, here came her bosom. Mary Alice stood by, sucking in her own small chest, hoping to help. The wire cut my hand, and I was stabbed 3 times by the barbs. But like a miracle, Grandma shimmied under. Mary Alice followed with plenty of room, though she didn't like to get burrs in her hair. Being a boy, I climbed the wires and pivoted over on the fence post, on the heel of my wounded hand. I dragged the hamper through, and now we were in a forbidden territory. It all looked overgrown and deserted to me. But Grandma, speaking low, said, "Hush up from here on, and keep just behind me." We were in trees and tall grass. As we sloped to the creek bottoms, the ground grew soggy underfoot. Dragonflies skated over the scum on the stagnant backwater. Grandma made her way along the willows, weeping into the water. When she pulled back a tangle of vines, we saw an old, worn-out, snub-nosed rowboat. It was pulled up and tied to a tree, and the oars were shipped in the wet bottom, beside a long pole with a steel hook on the end. "Work that rope loose," Grandma whispered to me. She pointed for Mary Alice to climb aboard, and she followed, reaching back to me for the hamper. The knot was easy, but pushing the boat out with Grandma in it wasn't. By the time the boat was afloat, I was up to my shoe tops in muddy water. I never thought for a minute that this was Grandma's boat, but she was one expert rower. She had the oars in the locks, and they pulled the water with hardly a ripple. She turned us and rowed along the bank under the low-hanging limbs. We were on our way somewhere, quiet as the morning. I was in the back of the boat, lolling, my mind drifting, and then I got the scare of my life. A low limb writhed and looped. I caught a quick glimpse of sliding scales and an evil eye, maybe a fang. Then an enormous snake dropped into the boat. It just missed Grandma's lap and fell hissing between her and me. The last thing I saw was this thing, thick as a tire, snapping into a coil. When I came to, we were tied up to a sapling, and Grandma was crouched over me. She was applying a rag wet with creek water to my forehead. Mary Alice was behind her, looking round-eyed at me. "You fainted, Joey," she accused. "Boys don't faint. I passed out, and it was probably mostly the heat. Sunstroke, maybe, and then I remembered the snake, and I grabbed up my knees." "Never mind," Grandma said. "It's gone. It was harmless. Good size, but harmless. There's cottonmouths around, though, so I keep my hands in the boat, if I was you." "It was swell," Mary Alice said. "It was keen. You should have seen how Grandma grabbed it by its tail and snapped it once and broke its neck." "It was all neck, if you ask me. Then she hauled off and she flung it way out in the water," Mary Alice went on relentlessly. Grandma's something with snakes. You should have seen it. Okay, okay, I muttered. Grandma stifled a rare smile. I suspected she had no high opinion of the bravery of the male sex, and I hadn't done anything to change her mind. Why wasn't it Mary Alice who'd done the fainting? It bothered me off and on for years. We were underway again, me keeping a sharp eye on low-hanging limbs. I was recovering from everything but embarrassment, and Grandma was rowing out from the bank. Now she was putting up the oars and standing in the boat. It rocked dangerously, though she planted her big boots as wide as the sides allowed. She reached down for the long rod with the hook at the end. Glancing briefly into the brown water, she plunged the rod into the creek. It hit something and began to pull the rod back up, hand over hand. She was weaving to keep her balance in the tipping boat. I wanted to hang to the sides, but pictured a cottonmouth rearing up and sinking its fangs in my hand. Something broke the surface of the creek, something on a chain Grandma had hooked. It was bigger than the picnic hamper and looked like an orange crate, streaming water, and inside, whipping tails and general writhing. I thought of cottonmouths and ducked, but they were catfish, mad as hornets, who'd have been drawn by Grandma's terrible cheese. She heaved in the crate and unlatched the top. In the bottom of the boat was a wire and net contraption that expanded as she filled it with wiggling fish. A catfish is the ugliest thing with gills, and even Mary Alice drew back her feet. Grandma kept at it, bent double in the boat. She was as busy as a bird dog, one of her own favorite sayings. When all the catfish were in the net, flopping their last in the bottom of the boat, she took the new cheese out of the gunny sack and stuck it in the crate. Grandma, how'd you remember where it was? I said, amazed. You couldn't see it, but you snagged it with the hook right off. Remembered where I sunk it, she said briefly. Now she was lowering the empty crate baited with cheese back in the water, except it wasn't a crate. It was a fish trap. Where we went in Wisconsin to fish, using a fish trap carried a $5 fine. Grandma, I said, is trapping fish illegal in this state? If it was, she said, we wouldn't have to be so quiet. What's the fine? Nothing if you don't get caught, she said. Anyhow, it's not my boat, which was an example of the way Grandma reasoned. Them critters love that cheese, she said fondly as the trap sank from view. She bent over the side to try to wash the smell off her hands, nearly swamping the boat. Soon we were gliding gently downstream, Grandma rowing easy. The catfish were at her feet, flopping less now. My brain buzzed. Dad was a dedicated fisherman. He tied his own flies. He was a member of the Conservation Club. What if he knew his own mother ran illegal fish traps? Brewing home beer was one thing because the prohibition law only profited the bootleggers. But we're talking about good sportsmanship here. I noticed Mary Alice's eyes on me. She was watching me around Grandma's rowing arm, and she was reading my mind. It was then we decided never to tell Dad. You could say one thing for Grandma's method. You got all your fishing done at once. It wasn't later that 8 o'clock, and maybe we'd gotten away with it. It seemed to me we ought to have brought some poles along and a can of worms, considering our catch. But I thought maybe things would settle down and we would have the quiet day in the country that Grandma wanted. Then we heard singing. I almost jumped out of the boat. It had felt as if we were alone in the world. Now this singing warbled up from around a bend in the creek, like a bad barbershop quartet with extra voices chiming in. Camptown ladies, sing this song, doo-dah, doo-dah. Grandma nudged the boat into the bank, just where the creek began to bend. Through the undergrowth, we saw a ramshackle building on the far bank. Above the porch was a sign, a plank with words burned in. Rod and Gun Club. A row of empty whiskey bottles stood on the porch rail, and from behind them came the singing. Bet my money on a bobtail nag, somebody bet on the bay. The porch sagged with singers, grown men in their underwear, still partying from last night. Old guys in real droopy underwear. It was a grisly sight,
and Mary Alice's eyes bugged. I wasn't sure she ought to be seeing this. They were waving bottles and trying to dance. I didn't know what they'd do next. Grandma was fascinated. As we watched, a skinny old guy with a deputy's badge pinned to his long johns stepped forth and was real sick over the rail into the water. Earl T. Askew, Grandma muttered, president of the Chamber of Commerce. But now a fat old geezer in the droopiest drawers and nothing else pulled himself up on the porch rail. Bottles toppled into the water as he stood barefoot on the rail, teetering back and forward, while the others behind him roared, "Whoa, whoa!" "Shut up a minute," he roared at them, "and I'll sing you a good song." He took a slug out of the bottle in his fist and began. "The night that Patty Murphy died, I shall never forget. The whole darn town got stinking drunk, and some ain't sober yet. The only thing they done that night that filled my heart with fear, they took the ice right off the corpse and put it on the beer." Then he fell back into the arms of the cheering crowd. "Ain't that disgusting?" Grandma said. "He couldn't carry a tune in a bucket." "Who is he?" I whispered. "O.B. Dickerson, the sheriff," she said. "And them drunk scumps with them is the entire business community of town." Mary Alice gasped. The drawers on some of the business community were riding mighty low. "They're not acting right," she said, very prim. "Men in a bunch never do," Grandma said. They were tight enough to fight, too, and we were on their private property. Not only that, we were in a boat full of trapped fish almost under the bloodshot eye of the sheriff. I thought it was time to head upstream as fast as Grandma could row. But no, she jammed an oar into the bank to push off. Then she began rowing around the bend. My heart stopped. The full chorus was singing again, louder as we got nearer. "Sweet Adeline, old pal of mine." The Rod and Gun Club came into view, and so did we. Mary Alice was perched in the bow. Grandma was rowing steady, and I was in the stern, wondering if the fish showed. It took the drunks on the porch a moment to focus on us. We were sailing right past them now, smooth as silk, big as life. "You're the flower of my heart, sweet Ad." They saw us, and Grandma saw them as if for the first time. She seemed to lose control of the oars, and her mouth fell open in shock. Mary Alice was already shocked and didn't have to pretend, and I didn't know where to look. Some of the business community were so far gone they just stared back, unbelieving. They thought they owned this stretch of the creek. A few, seeing that Grandma and Mary Alice were of the opposite sex, scrambled to hide themselves behind the others. But you never saw anybody looking as scandalized as Grandma was at the old birds in their union suits and less. They were speechless as her gaze passed over them all, recognizing everybody. It was a silent scene until Sheriff O.B. Dickerson found his voice. "Stop, in the name of the law," he bellowed. "That's my boat." Before the Rod and Gun Club was out of sight, Grandma had regained control of the oars. She rowed on as if none of this had ever happened. The sun was beating down, so she didn't push herself. After all, the sheriff couldn't chase us downstream. We were in his boat. And around another bend, a flock of turtles sunning on the stumps, Grandma pulled for the remains of an old dock. We tied up there, and now we were out of the boat, climbing a bluff. Grandma led, dragging the net of the catfish. I was in the rear, doing my best, with the picnic hamper. Mary Alice was between us, watching where she walked. She was scareder of snakes than she let on, if you ask me. An old house without a speck of paint on it stood tall on the bluff. Its outbuildings had caved in, and the privy stood at an angle. There were still prairie chickens around in those days, and they were pecking dirt. Otherwise, the place looked lifeless. Rags hung at the windows. The porch overlooking the creek had fallen off. Grandma tramped around to the far side of the house. She dropped her fish on the ground and waved us inside. Even in full daylight, the place looked haunted. I didn't want to go in, but Mary Alice was marching through the door already, so I had to. "Is anybody inside?" I whispered to Grandma as I lugged the hamper past her. Nobody but Aunt Puss Chapman, she said, like anybody would know that. It had been a fine house once. A wide black walnut staircase rose to a landing window with most of the stained glass still in. But it was creepy in here, dim and dusty. Smelled funny, too. We went into a room piled up with furniture, and then one of the chairs spoke. "Where you been, girl?" Mary Alice flinched, but the old woman, lost in the chair, was staring straight at Grandma and calling her girl. She was by many years the oldest person that we'd ever seen up till then. She was bald as an egg, and she needed a shave, and not a tooth in her head. "Who's them chillin' with you?" she demanded of Grandma. "Oh, just kids I found along the crick bank," Grandma said to our surprise. "They was fishin'." "I don't know as I want them in this house," Aunt Puss Chapman sent us a mean look. "Do they steal?" "Nothing you got," Grandma said under her breath. "Talk up, girl," Aunt Puss said. "You mumble. I've spoken to you about that before." She pulled her shawl closer, though it was the hottest day of the year. "I'm hungry. You hightailed it out of here after breakfast, and I ain't seen hide nor hoof of you since." "She ain't seen me for a week," Grandma mumbled to us, but she forgets. Then she called out to Aunt Puss, "Catfish, fried potatoes and onions, vinegar slaw, and a pickled peach apiece, and more of the same for your supper." "I suppose it beats starving," Aunt Puss snapped. "But hop to it, girl. Stir your stumps." I thought I might faint again. Nobody could talk to Grandma like that and live. She led us back to an old-time kitchen. It was in bad shape, but well stocked. Big sacks of potatoes and onions, cornmeal, things in cans. And we brought a full hamper to add to Aunt Puss's larder. I had to fire up the stove with a bunch of kindling while Grandma and Mary Alice went to work on the potatoes and onions. Mary Alice was in a big daze as I was. "Grandma, is that nasty old lady your aunt?" I stopped to listen. If she was, that made her our great-great-aunt. "Nah, I was a hired girl to her before I was married," Grandma said. "I lived in this house and fetched and carried for her and slept in the attic." "You had a room in the attic?" "Nah, I just slept up there. Had a bed tick with straw in it and changed it every spring. I haven't always lived in the luxury you see me in now." "What did she pay you, Grandma?" "Pay? She didn't pay me a plug nickel, but she fed me." I thought about that. "And now you feed her," I said, but Grandma didn't reply. We cleaned the fish on a plank table outdoors. I didn't care much for it. It made me kind of sick to hear Grandma rip the skin off the catfish. She had her own quick way of doing it, but every time it sounded like the fish screamed. She put me in charge of chopping off their heads, but I didn't like chopping off the head of anything looking back at me. And catfish have mustaches for some reason, which is just plain weird. Finally, Mary Alice took the rusty hatchet out of my hand, and whomp, she'd bring down the blade and that fish head'd go flying. Mary Alice was good at it, so I let her do it. Grandma gutted. It was afternoon before we sat down at the dining room table under a cobwebby gasolier. Aunt Puss was already at her place, so she was sprier than she looked. Grandma settled at the foot of the table. Without her hat, her white hair hung in damp tendrils. We'd been working like a whole pack of wild bird dogs. Watching Aunt Puss gum catfish was not a pretty sight. "These fish taste muddy," she observed. "Did you uns catch 'em?" "Yes," I said. "No," Mary Alice said. "What'd you use for bait?" Aunt Puss said, looking at both of us. "Cheese," I said. "Worms," Mary Alice said more wisely. Since we couldn't get together on her story, Aunt Puss changed the subject. "Do you children still in school?" We nodded. "Do they whoop ya?" "Do they what?" Mary Alice said. "Did they paddle your behind when you need it?" Aunt Puss looked interested. "Well, if they did, I'd quit school," said Mary Alice, who just completed 3rd grade. "They whooped that girl raw." Aunt Puss pointed her fork down the table at Grandma. I had a sudden thought. Aunt Puss thought Grandma and Mary Alice and I were all the same age. She hadn't noticed the years passing. That's why Grandma didn't say we were her grandkids. It would have just mixed up Aunt Puss. That's when she come to work for me. They throwed her out of school." Aunt Puss peered down the table. "Tell 'em why." We looked at Grandma, naturally interested to know why she'd been thrown out of school. Grandma waved us away. "I forget," she said. "I don't," Aunt Puss waved a fork. "It was because you wadded up your underdrawers to stop up the flue on the stove and the smoke out of the schoolhouse. That was the end of your education." "Working for you was an education," Grandma muttered, though only Mary Alice and I heard. It took another hour to clean up the kitchen the way Grandma wanted to leave it. When it was time for us to go, Aunt Puss was back in her chair in the parlor. "Where do you think you're off to now?" she called out as we trooped through the front hall. "Down to the sty to slop the hogs," Grandma called back. "Well, don't dawdle. You dawdle, and I've spoken to you about that before. Now get out of here," Aunt Puss hollered. "Let that door hit you where the dogs bit you." "Outdoors," I said. "Does she have hogs?" "She used to," Grandma said. "She was right well off at one time. She's poor now, but she don't know it." How could she? She still had her hired girl and plenty to eat. "Do you take her food every week, don't you, Grandma?" "Generally a good roast chicken. She can gum that for days." Grandma turned down the lane. "It keeps her out of the poor farm, and it gives me a quiet day in the country. That's a fair swap." Then her jaw clenched in its way. "But it's just private business between her and me, and I don't tell my private business." We walked country roads all the way home. Grandma set a brisk pace, and I struggled along behind with a hamper heavy with cleaned catfish. Mary Alice went in the middle, watching where she walked. By the time we got home, the trees in Grandma's yard were throwing long shadows, and it was evening in her kitchen. Mary Alice and I were both staggering. I was ready to go straight to bed. But Grandma said, "Skin down to that cellar and bring up 15 or 20 bottles of my beer. Just carry 2 at a time. I don't want any broke." I whimpered, but she was turning on Mary Alice. "And you and me are going to fry up a couple of pecks of potatoes to go with the fish. There won't be nothing to it. I peeled the potatoes this morning before you two was even up." We stared. The catfish fried in long pans with potatoes and onions at the other end popping in the grease. The kitchen was blue with smoke, and night was at the windows before we finished up. "Now I get down every platter I own," she told me, and then she sent for the card table I'd used for my jigsaw puzzle of Charles Lindbergh. Following her lead, we carried everything out into the night, making many trips. We lugged it all across the road and up to the Wabash Railroad right-of-way and planted the card table in the gravel. Finally, the platters of fish and potatoes overlapped on the table, and she opened beer bottles, stood in a row beside the tracks. As the drifters came along, being hounded out of town, Grandma gave them a good feed and a beer to wet their whistles. Mary Alice helped in an apron of Grandma's that dragged the ground. They were hollow-eyed men who couldn't believe their luck. 2 or 3 of them, and then 5 or 6, and then a bunch standing around the table eating with both hands and sharing out the beer. They didn't say much, and they didn't thank her. But she wasn't looking for thanks. She'd taken off her overalls and put the same wash dress back on, but she tied a fresh apron over it. Her hair was a mess, fanning out from the bun at the back, white in the moonlight. She watched them feed, working her mouth. And then she saw the swinging lanterns, the sheriff and his deputies coming along behind to keep the drifters moving. Up trooped O.B. Dickerson, dressed now with his badge on and his belt full of bullets, riding low under his belly. His deputies loomed behind him, but they weren't singing Sweet Adeline. Okay, break it up," he said, elbowing through the drifters. And then he came to Grandma. "Dag nabbit, Mrs. Dowdle, you're everywhere I turn. You're all over me like white on rice. Now, what do you think you're doing?" "I'm giving these boys the first eats they've had today." "Or yesterday," a drifter said. "Mrs. Dowdle, let me explain something to you," the sheriff bawled. "We don't want to feed these loafers. We want them out of town." "They are out of town." Grandma pointed her spatula at the sheriff's feet. "The town stops there. We're in the county." "Yes, and I'm the sheriff of the county," O.B. Dickerson bellowed. "You're in my jurisdiction." Well, do tell, Grandma said. Run me in. The minute she said that, all the drifters looked up. That was when Sheriff Dickerson's deputies saw they were outnumbered. Mrs. Dowdle, the sheriff boomed, I wouldn't know what to charge you with first. You're a one-woman crime wave. Where'd you get them fish, for instance? He said, wisely overlooking the home brews in the drifters' hands. Out of a trap in Salt Creek, Grandma remarked. Same as you get yours. Obie Dickerson's eyes bulged. Are you accusing me, the sheriff of Piatt County, of running fish traps? He poked his own chest with a pudgy finger. Not this morning, Grandma replied. You was too drunk. The drifters chuckled. And talking about this morning, the sheriff said, his face shading purple even in the darkness, you stole my boat. That's what we call larceny, Mrs. Dowdle. You could go up for that. Oh, the boat, Grandma made a little gesture with the spatula. You'll find it tied up at Aunt Puss Chapman's dock. As a rule, I take it back where you tie it up. But of course, I couldn't do this morning. How could I row these grandkids of mine back past the Rod and Gun Club? They've already seen what no child should. The sheriff and his deputies, blind drunk and naked as jaybirds, dancing jigs on the porch, and I don't know what all. It's like to have marked this girl for life. Grandma nudged Mary Alice, who stood there in a big apron looking drooped and damaged. I'm thinking about taking her to the doctor so she can talk it out. I don't want her to develop one of them complexes you hear about. Whoa, the deputies murmured behind Sheriff Dickerson. Earl T. Askew stepped up and said into his ear, Obie, let's just let sleeping dogs lay. I got my hands full with Mrs. Askew as it is. The sheriff simmered but said, Okay, Earl, if you say so. The sheriff and his posse were in retreat now, but he had to cover himself. Mrs. Dowdle, he said, pulling a long face, those things I can overlook, but it seems to me you're running a soup kitchen without a license from the Board of Health. I have an idea there's a law against that on the books. Go look it up, O.B., Grandma said. See if there's a law against feeding the hungry. But I have to tell you, you've talked so long, the evidence is all ate up. And of course it was. The drifters had wolfed down the last morsel. With a small finger, Mary Alice pointed out the bare platters. Only a faint scent of fried catfish lingered on the night air. The empty beer bottles went without saying. The drifters were moving off down the tracks, and the deputies were heading back into town. Obie Dickerson spit in the gravel, swung around, and followed them, his big boots grinding gravel. We stacked the platters and rounded up the beer bottles for Grandma's next batch. I collapsed the legs on the card table. There wasn't a lot of music in Grandma, but she was humming as she worked, and I thought I recognized the tune. The night that Patty Murphy died, I never shall forget. Then after our quiet day in the country, we carried everything back across the road under a $silver moon.